Welcome everybody to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. It is Business Monday, the 4 o'clock hour. Everyone knows what the 4 o'clock hour means. It means cha-ching, the money man, Gary Sasse, head of the Hassenfeld Institute up at Bryant University. Let's see, let's talk polls. So Gary Sasse floats an idea a couple of years ago about this idea of a Bill of Rights for students and for parents. We talked about it, I think, 2 weeks ago, and it has 10 points, and it says, listen, you have a right to a clean school and a good teacher, and basic elements. And we revive it a few weeks ago, but then we throw it into the poll. John Della Volpe recently completed a poll for GoLocal, and the poll says, of all the ideas that we tested, Fein Tower, free college education, the Students' Parents' Bill of Rights was the number one most strongly supported, with 84% of Rhode Islanders, regardless of demographic, regardless of age, regardless if they had children or didn't have children, 84% of Rhode Islanders thought that that's a strong idea and should be implemented. What's your takeaway from having the best idea in Rhode Island right now?
Well, it really gets back to the basics. Government exists to do things that people want. And people want safe neighborhoods, they want safe schools, they want good schools, and they want the government to help them make sure that there's availability of good jobs. So when you talk about a education Bill of Rights, and as we've discussed before, Rhode Island is one of the states that does not make constitutional education an enforceable right, you're dealing with basics. It also says something very interesting. It says that the ideas of the other candidates about education haven't really caught on.
Yeah, I agree.
Because, the governor's come out with 101 education programs, most of which, are good, sound good, but no one's connected the dots. No one's said to parents in the state, particularly urban parents, and there's an issue of racism when you deal with some of these issues as well. No one said to urban parents that you're gonna go to a school and your kid, a good teacher is going to be in front of your kid. If a good teacher is not in front of your kid, you're going to have a chance to get out of that place.
Yeah.
You're going to go to a school where you have modern textbooks. It's not going to be about Sputnik. It's going to be about AI, and you're going to have a clean environment. Those are very basic things. And when you look at what the performance of schools have been, particularly in urban schools, people understand this intuitively, and it's not really very complicated to say you have a good teacher. We're going to make sure you have a good teacher. You don't have a good teacher, you're out of there. You can have modern textbooks, good materials, a clean and safe environment in which to learn. That's basic blocking and tackling, as they say. And so to talk about computerizing every school and free this and free college and free that, it's fine. There's nothing. I'm not critical of those programs.
Well, don't those programs come after you do the basics? You look at, we have an editorial today that pulls out some of the performance numbers of Providence high schools. The Providence high schools, Mount Pleasant, Hope High School, well-known high schools in this state, and their performance levels are below abysmal. Where literally 1% of students in the high school is proficient at certain math achievements. And we're not talking about high-level math. We're talking about things like algebra and geometry. I mean, and you juxtapose it with the numbers from Barrington. I think geometry at Hope High School is 3% proficient, and at Barrington High School it's 70-something proficient. That's not a fair game, right? Those kids, regardless of whatever the factors are, it's not even in the ballpark of fairness.
No, well, you got to do both. In fairness, you can't stop making progress, and you can't
100%.
And you can't stop, proposing new ideas that help you make that progress. So it's not inconsistent to say that we're going to put.
It's not a zero-sum game.
No,
right?
That we're going to put additional funds into all-day kindergarten or into preschool, or we're going to put additional funds to computerizing, classrooms. That's part of leveling the playing field. That's part of bringing everybody up. But at the same time, you can't just cave to the teacher unions and other adults and not insist on real progress and real reform. And it's one of the great issues which economists have spoke about, but some of the educators or some of the politicians in the state ignore. You can invest a lot of money in preschool, but when the child gets into the public school, if there's not a good program in grades 1, 2, and 3, everything you lost, everything you invested in preschool. So you can do both. The other issue that's brought up that we sweep under the rug, you gave the Barrington Providence comparison. We have two school systems in the state, separate and unequal. You look at what's happening in urban schools, too many failing schools, too many failing kids, and it's not something that's come up in the last 3 or 4 years. It's generational. So we've created generation after generation of kids and their mothers and their grandmothers go into failing schools in some places and perfectly adequate schools in other parts of the state, and it ties to economic development more so now than it did 50 years ago. A kid could come out of a failing school, finish the 6th or 8th grade, get a job in a jewelry factory, make enough money to support a family, be working middle class, working class. Those jobs don't exist. So we put these kids in the schools where they have no chance of succeeding.
Right, zero.
And yet that's our future workforce, because if you look at the demographics of the state, and this is one of the big problems we have, is population growth has been flat.
Right.
Our growth of, we have a large percentage of our kids in college, they can't find jobs here, so they move on.
Well, listen, in the 3 o'clock hour, we had two companies in here. Right Solutions, a software company down in Middletown tied to the military. 90% of their work is government contracts, and then Squad Locker has raised about $15 million. What's the #1 challenge for you as a company? Workers.
Workers, yeah.
Right. So the chances of the student coming out of Mount Pleasant High School or Hope High School who only maybe 2 or 3% are proficient at the most basic elements of English or mathematics has very little chance to be able to go and work for either of those companies who are starving for workforce.
And we know what to do. This is what's so disturbing. You go to the governor's office, you go to the legislative leaders, you go to people running for governor, and they all will say if a child finishes the 3rd grade and he or she is not proficient at reading, chances of further academic success are very much compromised. And yet we tolerate it. We tolerate it in our inner cities. We tolerate it in some of the ring communities, which are developing more of the characteristics of inner cities as people migrate out. You mentioned it as the #1 workforce development issue. We've made some good investments in workforce development. The Real Jobs Rhode Island program is good. Some of the tax credits to create jobs are probably helpful, but the fundamental of a good quality education, we do kind of programs du jour, the flavor of the month. It's computers today, it's preschool tomorrow, it's free college the next day, and yet the rot continues in most of our buildings. And we get test scores, and there's some improvement in test scores, but the improvement is so minuscule in the big picture of things. It really doesn't matter, frankly, if 5% of the kids in the school are proficient in math or English, whatever you're measuring, and the next year it's 8%.
No, it doesn't.
What is it?
No, it's horrible. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's worse than weatherman achievement, right? Weatherman achievement is the lowest achievement you can get, okay? Weatherman or weatherwoman. Meteorologist achievement. If you get 50% of the weather predicted correctly, you keep your job for the next year. We're talking about 1, 2, 3, 5% proficiency. Proficiency doesn't get you anywhere. It's the basic level of accomplishment to move to the next grade. We're talking about some of these scores of 1 and 2%. I mean, how can you not blow up these buildings and start over? How could you possibly do worse?
But you can't do worse. But I argue that if you put your guarantee where your mouth is, and if you go buy a car and the dealer says, I guarantee the car for 10,000 miles, and you blow a transmission 5,000 miles, the dealer's going to replace the transmission. If you take that analogy and you take it to some of our schools and say, if you can't read by the 3rd grade, we're going to get you in a place where you can learn how to read over, in the next reasonable period of time, because we gave you a guarantee and we couldn't fulfill that guarantee.
Right.
It's good to buy a car. It's not good to educate your kids.
And listen, this isn't about Gina Raimondo or Jorge Alors or anyone. This trend has gone on for decades and has been, it's a third rail issue. It's hard to fix. And I won't say who it is because it might have been in confidence. One political business leader said to me one day, he said, one of the problems of why we don't fix schools in the city of Providence is because none of the decision makers have actually sent their kids to Providence Public Schools. So the governor lives over on the east side. She doesn't send her kids to Providence Public Schools. Previous mayors haven't sent their kids to Providence Public Schools. Nobody that is is in the first position to actually go in and see what it's like and be amongst the so-called common people. Well, there's 22,000 kids in Providence schools, and the vast majority of them, for multiple generations, have no fighting chance coming out of those schools.
I'd put it back on the legislature to this extent. We have been involved since 1981 in court cases, challenging the funding system,
right.
Challenging making education or access to an adequate education a constitutional right. And every time we've gone up there, we won with Judge Needham one time, and that was quickly overturned by the Supreme Court. But every other time we've gone up there, the courts have basically said, you've got the right problem, but the fix is with the legislature. And it is very, and from time to time, the legislature adopts a school aid formula. They do various things which are aimed to solve the problem, but they don't deal with it in a comprehensive way. And the best example was evaluation. We ran performance evaluation. We ran a commissioner out of the state who I thought was doing a good job, Deborah Gist. She was controversial and a little rough around the edges, wasn't perfect by any means, because people complained that their kids weren't doing well on the evaluation.
Yeah, right.
They should have been down on their knees saying, thank you, thanks for letting me know that my kid's not doing good on the evaluation, and how can he or she do good so when they finish the school, they get a good job and they can develop a professional skill. The other thing that makes the problem very different today is it's an economic issue. 60 or 70 years ago, it didn't matter that much because there were middle class, factory, blue collar,
absolutely,
jobs. Today, it's an economic death sentence because there are not enough of those jobs to go around. So we talk about workforce development. It's not retraining; it's training the kids in schools when they get out. They can do the technical work. They can go to a community college. They can go to a New England Tech. Spend 2 more years and get their prerequisite skills to become productive citizens, economically and socially, in this state. And then we're seeing the outcome now. So we talked about a Bill of Rights, not because there's any magic in a Bill of Rights, but to draw attention to the fact that you're never going to get to that place unless you gave the community the tools to fight back. And that's why we need a Bill of Rights, so parents can fight for their kids.
Does that require a constitutional amendment? Is that really the only way?
No, that's not the only way. There's no, if I told you there was one silver bullet, I would be misrepresenting. But there's no question in my mind that if access to an adequate education was an enforceable right, you would create enough pressure, within the Department of Education, within local school committees, within the legislature, to try to stay out of that pot.
Let's jump over to some other questions on the poll. Throw a couple out and see what your thoughts are. On the governor's race, it was pretty clear. Governors picked up a little bit of the undecided. Mayor Fung's dropped down a little bit from our June poll. They were tied at 33 then. The governor's moved up to 40% after spending about $5 million on her campaign. And Mayor Fung has dropped down to 32%, just a minor loss of support. Joe Trillo has remained the same. He was at 17% in June. He's at 17% now. John Della Volpe, the pollster from Harvard, says, hey, listen, the governor's made some movement, but the data shows, and a lot of questions about this governor's race, that Mayor Fung has been unable to capture the voice of traditional Republican values of being tough on holding the line on taxes and spending and growing the economy. And he underperforms in those areas and thus is not as in a competitive situation, including the factor of Joe Trillo, which clearly takes mostly out of his side. Your thoughts?
Well, I think it's difficult. Things are not that easy. I think there's kind of a confluence of problems, some caused by the campaign, some by the environment. Trump's a factor. The reality is that Trump is repugnant to many people in the state, independents, Republicans, and Democrats. I can go through a litany of things that the president's accomplished: tax cuts, regulatory reform, reshaping the court, isolating Iran, renegotiating NAFTA. Those are accomplishments, but they're so overshadowed by dividing kids from their parents. They're overshadowed by the rhetoric that comes out of the White House. They're overshadowed by him fighting with the Fed on interest rates. And so it's very hard for any Republican in the Northeast not to recognize they start from behind the curve.
Charlie Baker.
Well,
Charlie Baker.
Charlie calls it, like it is. And so, the governor and her PAC relatives have, brutalized, Alan for being a Republican and wearing a Trump hat at the inauguration.
So Trump had a side, we were talking before we came on air, and, it's difficult to say what Alan Fung clearly, consistently believes that he will, has articulated as something that he's going to transform as governor. And isn't that the separation? I think, whether you like her policies or don't like her policies, I think we have a good understanding of what she's going to do in her second term. She wants to extend free college from CCRI to Rick and Uri. She wants to rebuild the infrastructure of schools. She's got $250 million bond issue this cycle and another $250 proposed from 2 or 4 years from now. And she wants to continue her economic development strategy, who some agree with and disagree. There's certainly enough there to have healthy debates on. On the flip side, on Mayor Fung, I think folks are less clear on it, and clearly the polling showed that he didn't have the advantage on her on anything other than holding the line on taxes better than she does, but it was only a 5% margin. John Della Volpe said there's not a Republican gubernatorial candidate in the country that's not 10 points, 15 points up on their Democratic opponent, even if they're losing the race accordingly.
Let's put it into context. First of all, the incumbent, I don't care who the incumbent is, has an advantage because they are defending a record, and they can grow that record.
Yep.
A challenger doesn't have that, so the challenger has to come up, with ideas that capture the public attention, and the idea is that I'm not the person that's in office. And there's a fine line between tearing down your opponent, which you have to do against an incumbent, but capturing the high ground and saying, okay, I can do better, but this is how I can do better. And so I think what the point that you're making is the public is having a tough time identifying what the Fung administration would do better. Now, they point out certain things, you can agree or disagree. They cut taxes more, they cut sales tax, different view on immigration policy. Their approach to economic development would be less corporate welfare and more oriented to small business. And that's fine, but then you can agree or disagree with those messages, but once you've made those points, then you have to have a consistency of message. You have to grab the public attention.
Right.
So there's plenty there to do that with. I think they should sue their consultants for malpractice.
I would say, because those things may be true, that those are his strategies. It's hard to find those amongst his, certainly his media spend as of right now.
Well, he got, he's gotten knocked off stride to this extent. The negative avalanche that's come at him has been nothing like I've ever seen before. The intramural in Rhode Island, because no one's had this much money to spend on a campaign before.
I don't know. I think it's not the roughest, tumblest campaign. He's also fallen in this trap of fighting with Joe Trillo from the first debate straight through to last
the
week.
Internals, that's great.
Why even bother acknowledging his existence? Every time he talks about Joe Trillo has to spend $1 less. It's all free. And it elevates Joe Trillo to take more votes away from Alan Fung.
Well, the great President Ronald Reagan's 11th commandment was thou shalt not speak negatively of another fellow Republican.
Right. Whether he's running as an independent, whether I like him or don't, it doesn't seem to do much good.
And Lincoln's also said a house divided cannot stand. And those are kind of, basic lessons. So I can't explain that, but certainly when you're a minority party and there's a third person in the race, you're compromised. I don't care. If we were sitting in Idaho and a Democrat would be compromised by a third person in the race because that's such a ruby red state. We're just such a deep blue state that creates complications. The question then becomes, how well do you manage and handle those types of issues, and that's what can be questioned of how well that's been done. The other issue that I suspect in the campaign, that Republican primary in the previous cycle, there was a lot of antipathy and a lot of bitterness, and it exists, I think, to some extent to this day. I think there was a strategy to fight the last war, and then 2018 is very different from 2014. So I don't know if that makes any sense to anyone, but I sense that.
Let's jump over. You've got some new things going on at Bryant. We've got a few more minutes. Talk about what your initiative is on helping kind of voters determine.
Well, yeah, we think since we're the leadership, Bryant, the Hasfeld Institute for Public Leadership, that the most important issue, more important than anything we've discussed this today or before, that job one of any governor or any mayor is to be an effective leader. Mm-hmm. And so we've published a framework. It's not an evaluation. We're not going to go down and say, we think this is a strong leader, this is a weak leader on this point or that, but a framework for people to use in figuring out how do you measure strong leadership. And there are 6 factors in it. If you got a second, I'd like to go through them.
No, absolutely.
Because when you hear about these factors, then you can ask me the question about the campaign and the deficiencies in all the campaigns.
Yeah, that's right.
But the first is to focus. And so when you evaluate a candidate's leadership ability, can you identify just 1 or 2 issues that made specific promises because, as Charlie Baker would say, you ought to be focused on what matters to the people. And that's safe neighborhoods, good schools, and availability of jobs. The second, how effective are the candidates in molding public opinion? Has anybody in this campaign...
Bully pulpit, bringing the people along when they've got a big idea. How do you bring people together?
Well, how you bring people together is to tell the truth. And by telling the truth is say, this is where the state is for a particular problem. This is where it needs to be. And this is where I'm going to take it, and this is how you know when I've got there.
Yeah.
And so those are those 4 steps in molding public opinion. The other issue is to be a uniter and not a divider. How do you manage conflict? Because any governor has to depend upon the goodwill of others to get anything done. And if you're always fighting and not uniting, you're not going to get anything done. And the Poor Sox, whether you agree or disagree with the Poor Sox,
right,
it's a perfect example of not having a uniter in the State House at this time. The other issue, this is taught by Booz Allen, it's kind of basic, is getting the right people on the bus in the right positions.
Right.
And so we have some really good directors in the state. DEM, DOH, I think have very strong leaders. But then we also have UHIP, we have DCYF, and that was a product of poor personnel decision making, and as Ronald Reagan would say, personnel is policy.
Yeah.
And so that's the 4th one: focus, molding opinion, being a uniter, getting the right people in your administration in the right places. The 5th one is being a problem solver, but not just saying, well, we got to fix education, and we're going to fix education by having preschool. No. How are you going to solve the problem of kids coming to the 3rd grade, reading or finishing 3rd grade reading or not reading? A activity might be preschool, but what are the metrics? What are the measurements? Tell me how you're going to solve the problem. Don't tell me the mechanics of how you solve the problem. How are you going to solve the problem? And then the last one is maintaining the highest ethical standards. And you can figure out one of the ways during a campaign that helps you evaluate a candidate's ethics is just look at their commercials. Listen to their commercials. Are they honest? Are they distorting facts? And so those are the 6 factors. Ethics, problem solving, do you think they get the right people in the administration, the right places? Will they unite, not divide, recognizing that they can't do anything without somebody helping them, in molding public opinion where we're at, where we need to be? And then one or two things that you identify with the administration. I worked for a governor one time outside of Rhode Island, and he had a great saying. He said, I'm governor, and I can do any damn thing I want, but I can't do every damn thing I want.
Yeah, right.
And if you run a campaign that you could do everything, you could do nothing.
Well, both of us had interaction with Governor Bruce Sunderland. Bruce Sunderland was probably the most disciplined governor of identifying what his priorities were and pretty much ignoring those things that were not his priority. And if he was going to build an airport, he was going to build an airport. If he was going to build a convention center, he was going to build a convention center. If he was going to fix state hiring and the budget, that was it. By the way, anything after those priorities didn't get a lot of attention in his bandwidth. It might have senior staff might have taken on some of those issues from time to time, but he was about doing those things. And in his first 2 years, he did those things.
Well, Bruce used to have a great saying when you work for him. He said, if the Russians were in South Attleboro, you'd get something done. But that was...
It's absolutely true.
I heard it once, I've heard it 5,000 times.
Viewers, readers tomorrow who want to learn more about this, what can they do? Where do they go? We'll put the link in.
Okay, they can go to hassenfeld@bryan.edu.
We'll put all those connections in, and they can download.
They can download
this guy.
Yep, there's a little form, made simple, a kind of framework form to score each of the candidates on what you think their leadership capabilities are.
And it's about leadership.
It's job one.
It's a job one. I want to thank everybody. We're going to take about a 20-second break. We'll be back with Saul Kaplan from Business Innovation Factory. We're going to be talking at least part of the discussion about Sears Roebuck, who went bankrupt today. Thanks to Gary Sasse. We'll be back in the Navigant Credit Union in about 30 seconds. Thanks so much.